Hey, welcome back to On the Level Leadership. And today I want to talk about how to deal with that inner critic. So for this week, I thought I'd take it outside. It's been pretty nice weather, although there might be some background noise. So for that, I apologize in advance. There's a lot of people doing yard work in my neighborhood this week. But this week, I really wanted to talk about the concept of playing big and how when we make changes in our lives and or try to stretch ourselves, how we'll often be sort of attacked by our inner critic. Recently, my personal coach recommended that I read a book by Tara Mohr, and it's called Playing Big. I have the link for this book down below, should you be interested in it. But I'm obviously not all the way through this book yet, but one of the things that really struck me about this book was how it spoke to me, how it resonated with me, especially around the concept of the inner critic. So Tara talks about the inner critic in this book and refers to it as the voice in our heads that are characterized by certain qualities. Probably not always there, and they may not all be there to the same degree, but many of us who go through major shifts or when we're trying to think about maybe moving towards something else in our lives, these things can kind of come up for us. And I think it was really important to share that with you this week. So there's a few of them. One is that the inner critic's voice tends to be harsh and rude and mean, and it tends to really be binary or black and white in terms of its thinking. So if you hear things like I'm always, I never kind of language when you go to do something and you hear sort of an inner voice that says, oh, you never do this right. Oh, you'll never get this right. That's very binary and black and white. And so Tara's perspective is that if you hear that voice, it's probably your inner critic and not your inner mentor. It can be considered the voice of reason. So when you start dreaming, for example, you start dreaming big, you'll hear maybe an inner voice that might come to you and say, you know what, get out of the clouds, come down to earth here, it's nice. How about you stop dreaming, because you're never going to make that happen for yourself. The other things that it might actually tell you are things like you're not ready yet, you don't have enough skills, you don't have enough background, you don't have enough experience, or maybe it'll tell you you're not good enough at this because you're not great at math, or you've never run a business before. What makes you think you could run a business now? So that kind of language could certainly be your inner critic talking. It could be about your personal body perfection issues. And so Tara Mohr talks about how you could have a voice like, how can you be a health coach? Because, you go to food when you're depressed. They're going to see you're a fake, right? You need to lose 10 pounds like yesterday, and you're going on stage to do this TEDx talk, and you're not feeling your best, or you're overweight, or how dare you want to speak about mental health when you yourself are kind of a little bit stressed out, or you're not dealing with your emotions very well lately. This voice tends to be a tape or a broken record. It's something that you hear often, and the language is often similar to what you've heard throughout your entire life. It can be based on fear. So this inner critic could be completely irrational, right? So it could say, we know what the fearful head says is irrational, yet somehow it still has the power over us, as she put in the book, which I think is really interesting, because when we talk about imposter syndrome and the fear associated with change, that's definitely part of this inner critic piece, right? The 1-2 punch. I love this. And I'm going to read out of the book. It says, let's say first the inner critic starts mumbling to you about how everyone else in the room has it more together than you do. Then it follows up with a get a grip, get some perspective, or what is wrong with you? Other people are confident and relaxed. Just look out there at Susan. In other words, the critic first attacks you for having critical thoughts and then shames you for those same thoughts. It's called the 1-2 punch. Does that sound familiar? And then the last thing she says is the inner critic may take inspiration from critical people in your life. So you'll often hear voices that maybe resemble your mother's voice or your father's voice, or maybe some, key adult in your life when you were younger that would tell you to, not dream so big, or to come down to reality, or to not show off, or whatever it is that you heard as a young person, you now hear as an adult. So while the concept of inner critic is not exclusive to women, it definitely has no gender bias when it comes to this kind of thing. Us women tend to be particularly hard on ourselves when it comes to the inner critic. I know I am, where you might feel guilt about thinking about yourself, for example, or you might feel guilt about putting your career in front of other things, for example, or you may want to now start to focus on yourself or your career, but you feel that by doing so that somehow your family is going to be put second, and maybe you were raised to think that that wasn't allowed. So it can be really difficult for us women sometimes to kind of deal with that inner critic. But that said, if you're playing big and you're following your dreams and you're following your callings, that really can put any of us really in a very vulnerable place and allow that inner critic to really take hold and have a say. What I love about this book is that I'm not even like a third of the way through it yet, and already I'm getting nuggets of information I really want to share with you in this video today. I really felt it was important because so many of us are going through some big changes in our lives. In my case, moving from an employee to an entrepreneur, going from an employee mindset and working for somebody else in the public service, for example, to becoming my own boss and leading my passions around coaching and consulting and leadership development. That's a huge, huge shift, and it's a huge, huge change for me. And because of that, I feel like, man, how many other people out there are going through exactly what I'm going through, right? Who want to make some big changes, but are a little bit afraid, or maybe that inner critic has sort of taken over most of their lives and has really kind of kept them from being their best authentic selves. So I really felt impassioned this week to share this information with you. So if you don't have this book, especially if you're a woman, because this has a very female-centric sort of notion to it. And I say female-centric because, again, inner critics are not gender biased per se, but it has a bit of that leaning because there's a societal, cultural, psychological history with women and the use of the inner critic to keep us under control that this book kind of refers to. But I would say that this book is for any gender for the most part. There are things, nuggets out of here that anybody could really get out of this. So I really would encourage you to take a look at this book if this is something that you're considering, or rather something that you're really struggling with. So anyway, to get back to some of the tangibles, some of the practices that Tara talks about in this book, I'm going to go through these because I actually think they're super important. So if you feel like this inner critic has somehow taken over your life and become the main voice for you as opposed to your passion leading the way, or instead of your desires leading the way, then there are some really cool practices here that she discusses, what to do moment to moment as things arise. The first is to label and notice. So when you hear the critic talking, one of the things that she talks about in this book is to label the voice by simply saying to yourself, I'm hearing my inner critic right now. So really this is all about learning how to differentiate when you're being critical of yourself and what that voice sounds like and what the messages are, and just recognizing it. Kind of very similarly to when you do meditative practice and you hear or see thoughts come into your head and how you just notice them, recognize them, and then you let them kind of, if you're imagining, for example, that you're meditating along the Ganges River and you're seeing crocodiles floating down the river, as you notice the crocodiles, you just notice them and you let them continue to go down the river. It's the same with thoughts when you meditate, right? It's sort of like notice the thoughts, notice what they're saying to you, acknowledge them, and then let them continue to go on their merry way. Well, the inner critic is very similar to that. It's about labeling it. There's my inner critic. That's what's trying to say something to me, and just noticing it and then labeling it. That's super important. Separating the I from the inner critic is super important, according to her. I really love this because it's about separating yourself from your inner critic, because it's not your core self, right? Your critic is not the core you. So really it's about separating that I. So instead of saying I am freaked out by this, you could say my inner critic is freaked out by this. Now, that sounds a bit flighty when you're really rational. You're thinking, what? It's me, it's my voice. Why would I separate it? Because it's important to distinguish the thought that is based on fear or insecurity or some other critical thinking about yourself, separating it from your core self, which is the passionate self, the envisioned self, the emboldened self, right? So we want to separate those out. So when you refer to your critic, you should refer to it separately than you would yourself. The third thing she mentions in here is to create a character that personifies your inner critic. I love this tool. It's used by coaches globally. And the idea around here is to create a character out of this inner critic. So to visualize a character, a visual image of someone separate from yourself that actually critiques you, right? So it can be something really absurd, like a talking piece of avocado or a talking asparagus, for example. That's really absurd, but you can kind of imagine that. Or maybe you imagine, I don't know, a fire talking to you, or maybe it's a person, but it's a cartoon-like character. But anyway, the idea is to get a handle on this critic by giving it like a personification to separate it from yourself. It can also help you apparently sort of develop a bit of a sense of humor about this critic, right? So maybe coming up with something really absurd might be a way of kind of not downplaying, but kind of developing a bit of a comedic sense about this critic. The other thing she talks about is being really compassionate to your inner critic's motives. So understanding why the inner critic comes out. So the inner critic comes out to protect you. It's there to protect you from being hurt, from making a mistake, from being embarrassed. There's legitimate value to why this inner critic comes out, right? So she says to really check in with that and ask that voice, what is it you're trying to do for me right now? What is it that you're trying to protect me from? What are you most afraid of? What is causing you to be so critical of what it is I'm looking to do? So a great way to do this, she says, is to say, thanks for your input, but I've got this one covered. And she says to legitimately be compassionate about it, because this is your kind of inner child, your inner self, really nervous, really scared, maybe fearful, a bit insecure, and treat it a little bit like a child, right? Like a 3-year-old child who's afraid, who's reacting to some fear-based notion. And you don't help a 3-year-old fearful kid get over their fear by getting angry with them. You help them by being compassionate and understanding what it is they're going through, and maybe recognizing their concern and thanking them for that concern, but saying, you know what, as the adult in the room, I got this. Look for humor, if it is even possible. Ask yourself, what is absurd or funny about the critic and what it is saying right now? I can't even think of an example of this, but if there's something even humorous in what they're saying to you, I think that you should look for that. And I agree with the author's perspective on that. The sixth thing that she talks about is remove your critic from the scene. So you can either act out, in your head, you can act out the walking of your inner critic into a different space, or imagine them going into a different space. So what I love about this imagery or visualization is, let's say you've imagined your inner critic to be some absurd thing like a walking, talking, half avocado person. I'm only thinking avocado because I've been ketogenically dieted lately and I eat a lot of avocado in my diet, but you can picture it just sort of disappearing. So you can have it walk off. Thanks, I got this covered. And then you imagine it walking away from your space or maybe floating into space. I just think that's kind of a neat visualization, but it's really about taking that critic and saying thank you and then shoving it on its way. You can move it to a room, or you can move it to another place, or you can move it into a vessel like a cup or a bowl or a box. So you could imagine, for example, that you're saying, thank you, I got this covered, and then you're literally putting it in like a Tupperware container and closing the cover. And you can kind of hear it muffling at you and trying to talk to you, but really it no longer has the power anymore because you're kind of shutting it down. You can picture the voice receding into space. Again, I love this imagery where you can hear the inner voice saying, you can't do this. I don't know why you think you can do this. And you can kind of just imagine the voice sort of getting quieter and quieter and quieter as it disappears into space. I think that's a really great image. And then the other one is you could just simply imagine the volume of the voice being turned down. I think that's really powerful. When your inner critic is talking to you and telling you how worthless you are, or how dare you think you can do this. Just imagine the volume being turned down, and maybe imagine the passionate self of you saying, hey, you know what? You got this. You are smart enough and you can really do this. Kind of turn up that volume. So the other really important piece that Tara talks about in this book is how you can't really argue with the inner critic. You can't. So if your inner critic says, oh my God, you look so fat in this outfit, you cannot argue back saying, no, I look fine. Now shut the hell up, right? You can't say that to yourself. So one of the things she does talk about is just recognizing that is your insecurity talking and saying, you know what? I did everything I could. I'm exercising. I'm eating. This outfit looks fine on me. I got this. We're good. I'm going to be okay tonight. And just kind of reassure that inner critic that it doesn't need to pop up at this point in your life. It's really going to be okay. So to summarize, this is an awesome book, Playing Big by Tara Mohr. Highly recommend it. I do have the link down below should you be interested in reading it. I'm only about a third of the way through. I'm sure there'll be other videos to talk about other nuggets of information I've gotten out of this. I want to thank my coach, Gina, for providing this recommendation. It's an excellent, excellent book. And I really do think, when you're playing big or looking to change so in some cases it might be career changes. In other words, it might just be other major life changes. When you're looking to stretch beyond your comfort zone, a lot of things can try to get in your way. And most often, it's yourself. oftentimes we are our biggest critics, our biggest stumbling blocks, and our biggest issues. So a word of encouragement. If you want to play big, go for it. And when you want to deal with the inner critic, read Tara's book, follow this channel, talk to a friend, hire a coach, do whatever you need to do to make that change in your life, because that inner critic could really derail you if you let it be the sole voice that you're hearing inside your head. So anyway, I wish you all the best over the next week. I hope to see you next week. Talk to you soon.